Hello, LinkedIn. We are live with my guest, Donna O'Connor. Donna and I recorded an episode of the podcast probably a couple of months now, but it was released a few weeks ago and it's been doing phenomenally well. I think like when we reached out, Donna, to let you know how it had performed in the first week, I think it was something like 450 listens. I think it's edging closer to 500 now at the moment. So well done you. It's a testament to the conversation that we have and all of the sharing that you've done as well across social media and within your own network. So I appreciate that. Do you want to let people know a little bit about what you are? And really the purpose of today is to bring people's attention to the podcast episode that we've recorded if they haven't listened yet. There should be a link in the comments at some point to say this is the full episode. But also, it would be really great if anyone who has listened, or even if you haven't, just from the conversation that we're having today, you can pop questions. We are live, so pop questions on your LinkedIn below the event, and we'll get around to answering those. And if you're listening on the replay, then we can have a look at those at a later stage as well, and hopefully get around to answering those as well. So, Donna, over to you.
I was blown away by the engagement with it, and so delighted that people are interested in the topic. As I said at the beginning of the podcast, I'm an event organizer. That's kind of a quick synopsis of what I do, but I really kind of create interesting conversations for business leaders and HR directors, I think in particular, around topics that are of interest to them and what's changing within the profession and what the new demands are for them to know about and to engage with these topics.
And that's exactly why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because of the nature of the people that you're dealing with and the broad range of topics and the broad range of people that you interact with all the time. I thought it would be such an interesting thing. And I know like the overarching theme of the podcast is probably around diversity and inclusion, but we covered a huge number of topics. We talked about things like workplace culture, some of the challenges that HR directors in particular are having. But I know just before we went live here, back in the backstage area, we were talking about an area of inclusion that's maybe overlooked or that has changed in recent times due to the nature of the increase in costs and things. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you've seen out there?
Yeah, I mean, you asked me during the podcast if there was any area that that HR directors were reluctant. There was a bit of a no-go area, and at the time, sign of a good podcast, it was all spontaneous. Off the top of my head, I couldn't really think of anything. And kind of on reflection, afterwards, I said, one of the things I had addressed in Let's Talk Mental Health last year, that conference that we hosted in MongoDB, one of the topics I addressed was the whole impact of poverty on workplace well-being. And it's a new topic, I guess, to kind of think about. And I guess I'm linking it to the fact that, we're seeing rise in rent costs, so accommodation, energy, fuel, food, all those costs are rising. And so there's a new cohort of people who perhaps for the first time are actually financially struggling and may not maybe have a language around it. Maybe it's not something that they've experienced in their family before. It's not something they're comfortable to talk about in work. There are elements of shame and things like that around feeling that, you can't afford your family life, perhaps something that you haven't struggled with before. And I was surprised a lot of HR people were really keen to actually talk about it, because I think a lot of financial well-being programs, it's a very common element of a workplace well-being, will be to have a financial wellness piece to it. But historically, they have tended to start from the perspective of pensions and savings and what to do with the excess, and it's a whole different conversation when you start looking at what to do if you actually don't have enough money to perhaps enjoy your life as you previously expected to.
Yeah.
And I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but you could go on and on. I mean, it brings in I say this because we're talking this week as well about the whole, domestic violence leave, even taking that into broader just issues around relationships, the amount of people who are tied to living with previous partners because of financial constraints. All of that you will see an impact. You will see it in the workplace in some form or other.
Absolutely. And I think in relation to financial well-being, it's not something I covered on the podcast. It's something I've kind of had in the back of my mind. So I suppose a couple of asks from anyone who's watching today. If it's something that you're interested in learning more about, absolutely let me know, either here in the comments or drop me a message. But the other thing that I wanted to say is I always just assumed, I've never attended a financial well-being program or anything like that. I always just assumed that they would cover things like budgeting, and that's what, you know, I never felt compelled to learn about stuff like that. But the more I understand about what gets covered in financial well-being, is that it's kind of it's the stuff that they don't teach you in school that they really need to actually teach you about the basics around managing your finances, essentially. But I think you're bringing up a really interesting point there, Donna, that there could be some people out there at the moment who, for the first time in their lives, find themselves that they can't really afford to do the things that they're used to doing, or that they can't make ends meet with the amount that they're earning, with the way the costs are increasing at the moment across the board, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that came out in the podcast, I'm a font of information when it comes to the stories about what people are doing and what has worked well for them. And it's one of the things I enjoy the most about what I do, is actually just all the great stories I get to hear. So when I did the HR Champion Awards for the first time, I think that's back 7 years ago, the winner of the employee engagement strategy was a company called Kuhn and Nagel, the big logistics and distribution company. And their HR director, Gary McCabe, shared a great story about, they were prompted to help an employee who shared that she was struggling a little bit because her husband had become unwell. And so they had lost the second income in the family. And so they kind of directed her to the accountant to make sure that she was getting all she was due, and they began to realize that there's a lot of people, it isn't within their normal experience to perhaps look for financial advice, and that there was a possibility in their organization that not everybody was claiming the appropriate benefits, so they weren't aware of everything that they should. Their circumstances might have changed from when they actually joined the company and gave their details to accounts, and now it was different. And so they brought in an external person to literally sit at the back of the canteen, and people could go up and share all their their tax details and everything that was going on that might have impact on what they could claim. And he sort of worked on a kind of a no gain, no fee basis or whatever. And there were stories of employees getting, 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 euros back that they put on, that they totally unexpected. And the complete lift it gave everybody. Now, I think people are becoming more savvy about that now. My own children are, registered with tax back, and you know what I mean? So it's amazing what can happen in a short space of time. But at the same time, it was a real illustration of when HR understands what is taking from somebody's sense of happiness in work, and actually looks creatively as to how they might help it. It doesn't always cost the organization money. Sometimes it just needs somebody to be really intuitive around what is that distraction and how can we actually invest a little bit of our time and our thought into making that better. I thought it was a great story of HR and culture kind of just making everybody's experience better without actually spending money on the situation.
It sounds really incredible, such an incredible story, and such a simplistic thing to do. And I know, there's loads of studies that show that money isn't necessarily a cause for happiness at work, but it can take away from your happiness if you're struggling. And certainly, like if I was to find another 5, 6, 7 grand in my income in a year, I would be absolutely delighted, I don't think there's anyone who wouldn't be. But one of the points that you made earlier, Donna, was about the difficulty in kind of speaking up about these things. And I think we find it hard enough to talk about money as it is, even when times are good. But especially so if you're struggling, it's kind of hard to articulate what's going on. And like you say, this could be the first time someone has experienced this. Any thoughts or any words of wisdom to share with people on maybe taking the first step, or even for HR people maybe to do what Gary did and open up that dialogue and open up those conversations around helping people to manage their money?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all comes down to, I suppose, suspending assumptions a little bit. Do you know what I mean? So to not assume, say, if you're working with, young employees in the tech sector who seem to be earning, fantastically well, and not to assume that group never experience financial concern, and then to assume that people at lower paid income or lower paid jobs are more likely to be experiencing it. So it's I think the lifestyle can have huge impact, where people have been renting for a period of time. Living in Dublin is getting impossible for people coming, people who've moved, perhaps, engaged in a hybrid work model, could be living, in Meath or something during the week, but may be required to come in. So they may be paying a higher percentage for accommodation, for just short-term accommodation. So things can change people quite rapidly. And you could have set up a lifestyle based on two incomes. There's a lot of redundancies recently in the tech sector. That can have significant impact. So I think it's to suspend assumptions, keep the conversation open. I mean, that's what we're hearing at the moment. That's what HR people are doing. There's no topic off the table. But as I say, I guess things like words like poverty and that, people have an assumption as to what that, who that refers to. And if we don't open up our vocabulary and say, actually, that could refer to a middle manager, that could refer to, and it's all, as I say, it's all about suspending assumptions, keeping dialogue, being careful of language, and just creating an environment. And we talked about this on the podcast, where people feel actually safe to say things.
And it's really interesting, because exactly like you say, that people could be feeling this, but they don't feel that it's okay to speak up about it. And again, this assumption that we have of how comfortable people are, or uncomfortable that they may be experiencing whatever is going on in their personal life. I love those examples that you used, where you might be used to having two incomes, and now suddenly you're gone down to one, and that's causing a lot of hardship, but people won't necessarily share that, or they won't necessarily speak up about that. So I think it's about having that understanding. And we covered so much ground around inclusion at work on the podcast itself. So if anyone hasn't listened to the full episode, there should be a link below in the comments for you to listen to the full episode, or it might even be above in the description. I can't remember how I did it this time, but do go and check out that full episode. And Donna, any parting words for anyone who's tuned in today?
As I say, I think what I really enjoy is all the storytelling, and I think that seize any opportunity you get to meet with peers and to share, in kind of an in-camera situation, where you can actually talk about your experience and give people an opportunity to learn from it. I think there's no judgment in these situations. I organise HR directors dinners, and people stay an hour or so afterwards and pop off and have, offline conversations, and just learn from each other. And I think we get a lot from the storytelling, but in order to encourage other people to be open, you yourself have to be open. So, bring a few stories of your own that you're prepared to share. You might get some wisdoms back.
I love that. Storytelling has come up so much on the podcast. So if anyone is looking for any storytelling episodes, let me know. Another thing actually that you mentioned that I was like, that could be a whole other topic, is this idea of the return to work. So if someone's working outside, this is a global audience here with the Happier at Work podcast, but if someone has moved, or if they're outside of the kind of the commuter zone of where they would normally work, and then suddenly they're called back into the office, that there's a return to work mandate, essentially, it can put a real struggle on people if they're going to have to pay for accommodation, and that's something that's way more expensive than
and they could have been living in the city previously, so they might not have needed a car, but they may now be commuting from somewhere. They may have to either rent a car, borrow a car, buy a car, so there's a whole hybrid work has brought so much flexibility and so many great things, but I think that it does maybe put a few new financial pressures on people. So again, keep the conversations open and share the experience, and all boats will rise with it.
This is it. And thank you so much, Donna, for your time today. Thanks again for your time on the Happier at Work podcast, the full episode, and I look forward to chatting to you again soon.
Absolutely. Next time with wine, Aoife.
Absolutely. That's it.